The Tudor dynasty has been told and retold so many times that it almost feels like we already know everything about it. Kings and queens locked in scandal, political plots, dramatic executions, and of course, the infamous 6 wives of Henry VIII. But what if I told you that the real Tudor story is far bigger than one king's marital history? That behind the familiar tales of passion and betrayal lies a world of power plays, dangerous diplomacy, religious revolutions, and the lives of millions of ordinary people whose struggles and ambitions shaped England as much as any monarch. Picture a kingdom still haunted by the ghosts of civil war, where loyalty could be the difference between wealth and the executioner's block. Imagine a court where every smile might hide a scheme, and alliances could turn to enmities overnight. Beyond the throne rooms and battlefields, traders were pushing into new markets, explorers were setting sail for unknown shores, and the printing press was transforming how ideas spread. This was an England standing on the edge of the modern world, not yet certain of its identity, yet already laying the groundwork for the nation it would become. The Tudors didn't just navigate their time, they reshaped it. Henry VIII's break with Rome was more than a personal drama. It tore down centuries of papal authority in England and set the stage for a new kind of monarchy, one that could bend religion to serve its political needs. His daughter Mary fought to reverse that transformation, driven by a belief that the soul of the nation was at stake, while Elizabeth I learned to walk the tightrope between rival factions, using diplomacy, image, and intelligence to hold her realm together in a Europe torn apart by faith. And while their names dominate the history books, the Tudor world wasn't just about its rulers. Farmers, merchants, apprentices, sailors, and scholars all lived through the upheavals of the age. Their labor built the economy that fueled royal ambitions. Their voices filled marketplaces and churches, their customs shaped community life, and their willingness, or refusal, to accept change determined whether reforms would stand or fall. In their own way, they were as much a part of the Tudor story as the kings and queens whose portraits hang in museums. This was a time when England began to see itself differently, as a distinct nation, as a player in international politics, and as a place where the written word could spark movements. From the grandeur of court pageants to the stench of the city streets, from the gold-laden dreams of explorers to the whispered fears of conspirators, the Tudor era is a tapestry woven from ambition, fear, faith, and power. And once you look beyond the myths, you start to see a story that's not just about the past, but about how nations are built, how ideas take root, and how ordinary people can be caught up in extraordinary change. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, and in this video, we're going to step beyond the castles and coronations to uncover the Tudors as you've never seen them before. We'll explore the political gambles, the cultural triumphs, the quiet rise of Parliament, the religious upheavals, and the daily lives of the people who lived through it all, revealing why this dynasty still shapes the world we live in today. The history of the Tudor period is often told as a series of dramatic episodes centered on Henry VIII and his 6 wives. The story is familiar to many. The young king marries Catherine of Aragon, falls in love with Anne Boleyn, and eventually changes the religious landscape of England so he can remarry. The chain continues through Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, ending in a mix of tragedy and political intrigue. It is a compelling narrative, but it has been repeated so often that it has become the lens through which the entire dynasty is seen. This focus has obscured the complexity of the Tudor world and the broader forces that shaped it. By concentrating on courtly marriage drama, the real political, religious, and social shifts of the period can fade into the background. When Henry VIII is reduced to a man who simply could not stop marrying, the story ignores that he inherited a relatively fragile crown from his father, Henry VII. The first Tudor king had come to power after years of civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII's reign was spent consolidating power, controlling ambitious nobles, and stabilizing a kingdom that had been torn apart by factional rivalries. This legacy mattered to Henry VIII. His reign was not just about romance or ego, but about asserting royal authority in a country where the nobility still had the means to challenge the throne. The execution of figures like Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, was not only personal paranoia, but part of a broader effort to prevent any challenge to the monarchy. Seen in this light, the break with Rome in the 1530 was not only about Anne Boleyn, but about ensuring the crown had final say in religious as well as political matters. The English Reformation is often described in simplified terms, as if it was solely Henry VIII deciding he wanted a divorce. In reality, it was a complex process shaped by theology, politics, and international diplomacy. The king's decision to declare himself supreme head of the Church of England did not happen in a vacuum. Across Europe, reform movements were challenging the authority of the Pope. Martin Luther had already sparked controversy in the German states, and ideas about Scripture and the nature of salvation were spreading quickly through the printing press. In England, there was a growing undercurrent of dissatisfaction with the wealth and influence of monasteries, and some saw reform as an opportunity to redirect those resources to the crown. Dissolving the monasteries was not just an act of religious reform. It was also a massive transfer of land and wealth to the king, his allies, and loyal supporters, reshaping the economic structure of the country. Henry VIII's reign is usually treated as the defining point of the Tudor story, but focusing only on him distorts how we see the rest of the dynasty. His son, Edward VI, often appears in history books as a frail boy king who reigned briefly before dying young. But during his short time on the throne, England saw a rapid push toward Protestantism that went far beyond what Henry had allowed. The Book of Common Prayer was introduced, images were stripped from churches, and Catholic rituals were banned. This was not just youthful idealism. It was the work of powerful figures like Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who sought to consolidate their own power by directing religious reform. If we think of Edward's reign only as a prelude to Mary I, we miss the fact that these years were when the foundations of English Protestantism were deeply set. Mary I's story is also often told in shorthand. She tried to restore Catholicism, married Philip of Spain, and became known as Bloody Mary for the persecution of Protestants. This reduction hides the fact that she was a capable political operator who faced enormous challenges. She inherited a realm where Protestantism had taken firm root among influential nobles and merchants. Restoring papal authority was not simply a matter of issuing decrees. She had to navigate diplomatic relationships, especially with Spain, while dealing with rebellions like Wyatt's uprising in 1554. The burnings of Protestant martyrs were meant to deter opposition, but they also turned public opinion against her, a problem her counselors struggled to address. Her reign demonstrates how fragile religious settlement was in the mid-16th century, and how deeply tied it was to questions of foreign policy and succession. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, tends to be presented as a golden figure presiding over a triumphant age of exploration, cultural flourishing, and national pride. While she was indeed a shrewd and skilled ruler, this image overlooks the fact that her reign was filled with constant political challenges. She faced threats from Catholic powers abroad, especially Spain, and from Catholic plots at home, many of which centered on Mary, Queen of Scots. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 is often portrayed as a final, peaceful compromise, but in practice it was under constant strain. Puritan groups pushed for further reforms, while Catholic recusants resisted the Protestant structure. Her reluctance to marry was not simply personal, but a calculated political decision, keeping foreign alliances flexible while avoiding the internal instability that might arise from a powerful royal consort. Beyond the monarchs, the Tudor era was defined by sweeping changes in governance and society. The development of the royal bureaucracy meant that the king or queen could increasingly govern without relying entirely on the great nobles. Figures like Thomas Cromwell transformed how the state collected revenue and administered law, laying foundations for a more centralized government. The expansion of Parliament's role, particularly in religious legislation, set precedents that would matter in the Stuart period. Trade grew, towns expanded, and England began to participate more fully in overseas ventures, planting the seeds of future imperial ambitions. The period also saw profound cultural shifts, with the spread of literacy, the growth of the printing industry, and the influence of Renaissance humanism shaping art, literature, and education. The narrow focus on Henry VIII's marriages has had another unintended consequence. It has reduced the agency of other figures in the Tudor world. Queens consort are often remembered only in terms of their relationship to the king, but many of them had significant political and cultural influence. Catherine of Aragon acted as regent during Henry's campaign in France and secured a major victory at the Battle of Flodden against Scotland. And Boleyn promoted reformist scholars and played a role in the spread of Protestant ideas. Catherine Parr not only acted as stepmother to Edward and Elizabeth, but also published her own theological works, unusual for a queen at the time. Outside the royal family, noblewomen, diplomats, and courtiers shaped policy and culture in ways that deserve closer attention. Even the common people of the Tudor realm were active participants in the changes of the time. Popular uprisings like the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 were not just outbreaks of disorder, but organized responses to the dissolution of monasteries and fears about religious change. The rebellion brought together thousands of people from different regions, united by a mix of economic grievances and attachment to traditional faith. Later, the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549 in Devon and Cornwall was driven by opposition to the imposition of the English-language Book of Common Prayer, reflecting how deeply religion was tied to local identity. These events remind us that the Tudor period was not simply shaped from the top down, but through the interactions between rulers and the ruled. Diplomacy in the Tudor period is another area often overshadowed by domestic drama. England's position in Europe was precarious for much of the dynasty. The country was not the dominant power it would later become, and it had to navigate a world where France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire were major players. Marriages, alliances, and wars were carefully calculated to balance these powers. Henry VIII's shifting alliances between France and Spain, for example, were not signs of indecision but deliberate attempts to keep England relevant in continental politics. Elizabeth I's cautious approach to aiding Protestant rebels in the Netherlands and her delayed support for military action against Spain were also shaped by the realities of limited resources and the risks of direct confrontation. By stepping back from the familiar narrative of Henry VIII and his wives, a different picture of the Tudors emerges. This was a period of deep and lasting transformation in England, involving shifts in religious identity, the structure of government, the economy, and the relationship between the crown and its people. It was also a period of constant negotiation with the wider European world, where England's survival often depended on careful diplomacy. The personalities of the monarchs mattered, but so did the actions of ministers, nobles, commoners, and foreign powers. The stories of individuals are compelling, but they are part of a larger tapestry of change and conflict that cannot be understood through marriage history alone. Reassessing the Tudors in this way does not mean dismissing the drama of Henry VIII's personal life. Those events were real and had significant consequences, but they were part of a larger context in which political necessity, religious change, and social pressures were equally important. By broadening the focus, we can see that the Tudor dynasty was not defined solely by personal relationships at court, but by a constant struggle to shape and control a kingdom in the midst of profound change. This approach allows for a richer understanding of the period and restores depth to a history that has too often been flattened into a tale of 6 queens and a king's desires. One of the most important, yet often overlooked, aspects of the Tudor period is the transformation of the monarchy's relationship with Parliament. In the late medieval period, Parliament was primarily a tool for the king to raise taxes when needed. It was summoned irregularly, and its influence was limited. During the Tudors, particularly under Henry VIII, Parliament became a key instrument for implementing policy. The Acts of Supremacy and the Acts of Succession were passed through Parliament to give legal weight to the king's religious changes. This use of legislative authority helped to legitimize what could otherwise be seen as a usurpation of ecclesiastical power. It also set a precedent for using parliamentary statutes to make sweeping changes in governance and religion, a precedent that would shape English politics long after the Tudors. The legal reforms of the period are also notable. Henry VIII and his ministers expanded the use of statutes to centralize authority. Regional councils, like the Council of the North and the Council of the Marches in Wales, were strengthened to enforce royal authority in areas distant from London. This was partly a response to the challenges of governing a kingdom where travel was slow and communication limited. It also reflected a recognition that loyalty to the crown could not be assumed in regions with strong local identities and traditions. The dissolution of monasteries created further administrative challenges, as the government had to manage and redistribute a vast amount of property and wealth. This process involved surveying lands, recording ownership, and establishing new systems for collecting rents and taxes, all of which expanded the reach of the state. The economic shifts of the Tudor period are often overshadowed by religious and political drama, but they were significant in shaping daily life. The influx of land from the dissolution of monasteries changed patterns of ownership and tenancy. Many of the monastic lands were sold to members of the gentry and wealthy merchants, increasing the power and influence of this social group. This redistribution of land also encouraged a shift toward more commercial farming practices, with some landowners enclosing fields for sheep grazing to take advantage of the profitable wool trade. Enclosure, however, was deeply unpopular among those who lost access to common lands, leading to tensions and uprisings. The government responded to these disturbances with a mix of repression and limited reforms, reflecting the difficulty of balancing economic innovation with social stability. The Tudor economy was also shaped by England's growing participation in international trade. Under both Henry VII and Elizabeth I, efforts were made to strengthen England's position in European markets. The establishment of the merchant adventurers and other trading companies expanded English exports, particularly in cloth. By Elizabeth's reign, ventures like the Muscovy Company and the Levant Company were extending English trade into new regions. These early steps toward overseas expansion were cautious compared to later imperial ambitions, but they laid important groundwork. Figures like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh are remembered for their daring voyages, yet their actions were part of a broader pattern of exploring new trade routes, seeking valuable resources, and challenging Spanish dominance. Religion remained the most divisive and destabilizing force in Tudor politics. The religious settlement of Elizabeth's reign was intended to create unity, but in reality it left significant groups dissatisfied. Puritans, influenced by Calvinist ideas from Geneva, saw the settlement as incomplete and pushed for further reforms, including the removal of all vestiges of Catholic ceremony and hierarchy. Catholic recusants, on the other hand, refused to attend Anglican services and sometimes maintained secret networks of priests. These divisions were not just theological, they were tied to questions of loyalty and identity. The Pope's exclusion of Elizabeth in 1570 created a real fear that Catholic subjects might be encouraged to support foreign invasions or domestic rebellions. The government's response included tighter surveillance, harsher penalties for recusancy, and the execution of those involved in plots against the crown. The role of propaganda in the Tudor period deserves closer attention. Monarchs and their ministers understood the importance of shaping public opinion, even in an age before mass media. Royal progresses, elaborate court pageantry, and public proclamations were used to project the image of a strong, divinely favored ruler. Printed works, such as official homilies and polemical pamphlets, helped to reinforce the religious and political positions of the government. Elizabeth I was particularly adept at managing her public image, using portraits, speeches, and ceremonial appearances to cultivate the persona of the Virgin Queen devoted to her people. This was not mere vanity. It was a calculated political strategy to maintain authority and unity in a realm where challenges to her legitimacy persisted. Foreign relations under the Tudors were a constant balancing act. Henry VII's cautious diplomacy aimed to secure the dynasty's position through marriage alliances and trade agreements. Henry VIII's foreign policy was far more aggressive, marked by costly wars with France and shifting alliances with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. These conflicts were driven by a mix of personal ambition, the desire for glory, and the need to assert England's relevance in European affairs. Edward VI's government pursued alliances with Protestant states, while Mary I's marriage to Philip of Spain tied England to Habsburg interests, including war with France. Elizabeth I's long reign required a careful navigation of the Protestant-Catholic divide in Europe. Her support for the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, involvement in the French wars of religion, and eventual confrontation with the Spanish Armada in 1588 all illustrate how foreign and domestic politics were inseparably linked. Another overlooked element of the Tudor story is the experience of Ireland. English control over Ireland during this period was incomplete and often contested. The Tudors sought to extend royal authority beyond the Pale, the area around Dublin where English influence was strongest. Efforts to impose English law, culture, and Protestant religion met with resistance from Gaelic lords and the Old English nobility. Rebellions in Ireland, such as the Desmond Rebellions and Tyrone's Rebellion, were costly and difficult to suppress, draining resources and attention from other concerns. The policies pursued in Ireland, plantation schemes, suppression of local customs, and military campaigns, foreshadowed later patterns of colonial rule. Social life in the Tudor era was shaped by both continuity and change. The traditional hierarchies of nobility, gentry, yeomanry, and common laborers remained intact, but shifts in land ownership and economic opportunity were altering the balance. The growth of towns created new centers of trade and craft production, and urban populations became increasingly important to the economy. Education expanded, particularly for boys from the gentry and merchant classes, fueled by both humanist ideals and the need for literate administrators in a more complex state. Grammar schools and universities flourished, and literacy rates rose, enabling greater participation in religious debates and political discourse. The cultural achievements of the Tudor age are often celebrated as part of the so-called English Renaissance. Figures like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser created works that have endured for centuries. The court was a patron of music, drama, and the visual arts, with foreign artists and musicians contributing to a vibrant cultural scene. Yet it is important to note that this flourishing culture was also shaped by political agendas. Court entertainments often reinforced royal authority and celebrated military victories. Translations of classical texts and religious works served to promote specific moral and doctrinal messages. In this sense, the arts were not separate from the political and religious life of the period, but deeply entwined with them. By looking beyond the familiar story of Henry VIII's 6 wives, it becomes clear that the Tudor period was defined by a web of interconnected developments. The strengthening of the state, the redefinition of religious identity, the expansion of economic and trading networks, the cultivation of royal image, and the constant negotiation of England's place in a dangerous and shifting European order. The drama of courtly marriages may capture the imagination, but the real story lies in how a relatively small and politically unstable kingdom transformed itself into a more centralized and assertive state, setting the stage for the challenges and conflicts of the 17th century. The Wars of the Roses did not simply end with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth. The conflict left deep scars in the political consciousness of England, shaping how the new dynasty approached rule. Henry VII understood that his claim to the throne was not unassailable. He was descended from the Beaufort line, legitimized but barred from succession by an earlier royal decree, and his marriage to Elizabeth of York was a political strategy to unite Lancaster and York rather than a resolution of rival claims. His reign was therefore a constant exercise in securing legitimacy. He eliminated rivals through calculated alliances, strategic marriages, and when necessary, executions. He cultivated a reputation for order and prudence, but beneath that was a constant vigilance against any resurgence of factional conflict. This atmosphere of watchfulness would influence his son Henry VIII, who inherited not only the throne but the awareness that a king's position could still be contested. Henry VII's policies set a tone for Tudor diplomacy that balanced caution with ambition. He avoided costly wars but used treaties, trade agreements, and marriage alliances to place England in a stronger position in Europe. The marriage of his daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland was a calculated step towards securing the northern border, while the betrothal of his eldest son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon linked England to the powerful Spanish kingdoms of Ferdinand and Isabella. Even when these arrangements did not go as planned, Arthur's early death, for example, they created diplomatic connections that would shape later events. Henry VII's approach showed that military might was not the only measure of a monarch's strength. The careful weaving of political relationships across courts in Europe was equally vital. When Henry VIII came to the throne, he initially seemed inclined to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy. His early campaigns in France, conducted in alliance with Spain, were costly and yielded limited gains. Yet they reflected a desire to assert England's relevance on the continental stage. Over time, Henry's diplomatic strategy became more opportunistic, shifting alliances between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire to prevent any one power from dominating Europe. This pattern was not unique to England. Many rulers of the period engaged in similar balancing acts. But in Henry's case, it was often tied to personal ambitions for military glory and dynastic prestige. The competition for influence between European monarchs was as much about perception as actual control of territory, and ceremonial displays, elaborate embassies, and negotiated marriages all played a role. The marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon was itself part of this broader diplomatic dance. It was intended to reinforce the Anglo-Spanish alliance, but when political realities shifted, so too did the value of that connection. The annulment crisis of the 1520s cannot be understood solely as a matter of personal desire for Anne Boleyn. It was also about repositioning England in a Europe where the Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, held considerable power. Breaking with Rome not only allowed Henry to remarry, but also gave him control over the English Church, reducing papal influence and freeing England from certain diplomatic constraints. This was a bold move in the context of European politics, where the Pope was both a spiritual leader and a political actor. It also marked a step toward a more modern form of statecraft, in which the authority of the state could override traditional religious structures. The centralization of power under the Tudors was not achieved by monarchy alone. Parliament, though still subordinate to the crown, became a key mechanism for enacting major changes. Henry VIII's religious reforms were implemented through a series of statutes, lending them the force of law and making them harder to challenge. This use of parliamentary authority had the unintended consequence of enhancing Parliament's importance. Once the precedent was set that fundamental changes to the realm required parliamentary approval, it became more difficult for future monarchs to govern without it. In the short term, Parliament was a tool of royal policy. In the long term, it was becoming an institution with its own weight in the balance of power. The rise of Parliament during the Tudor period was subtle but significant. Under Henry VII, it had been used sparingly, summoned primarily for taxation and the ratification of laws that reinforced the crown's authority. Henry VIII, however, called it more frequently, especially during the years of religious change. The legislative process gave reform an air of collective endorsement, even if the monarch's will was the driving force. This gradual expansion of Parliament's role laid foundations for future conflicts over sovereignty. The idea that the king or queen ruled with the consent of the realm, expressed through Parliament, was taking shape in practice even if it was not yet fully articulated in theory. Diplomacy in the Tudor world required more than formal treaties. It depended on a network of ambassadors, informants, and agents who could gather intelligence and influence events beyond England's shores. The competition between European powers was as much about information as it was about armies. A skilled ambassador could warn of shifting alliances, negotiate favorable trade terms, or sow discord among rivals. The Tudors invested in cultivating such figures, recognizing that knowledge was as much a weapon as the sword. By Elizabeth's reign, this system had become more sophisticated, with men like Sir Francis Walsingham overseeing networks of spies that extended across Europe. These efforts were aimed not only at foreign threats, but also at uncovering domestic plots, particularly those tied to religious dissent. The dynastic struggles that shaped the Tudor claim to the throne were never entirely resolved in the minds of their contemporaries. Pretenders like Perkin Warbeck in Henry VII's time showed that lingering loyalties to the House of York could be exploited. Even in later reigns, the question of succession remained a source of instability. Edward VI's attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne bypassed his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth, triggering a brief but significant crisis. Mary's accession and later her marriage to Philip of Spain reignited fears about foreign dominance. Elizabeth, though popular, faced constant speculation about her marital prospects and the potential claim of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Tudors maintained power in part through careful control of succession politics, but the very fact that these issues persisted showed how precarious their position could be. In dealing with foreign powers, the Tudors were constantly aware that England was not the largest or wealthiest kingdom in Europe. This reality required a blend of assertiveness and restraint. War was expensive and could be disastrous if poorly managed. Henry VII's cautious approach kept England out of unnecessary conflicts, allowing him to focus on internal stability. Henry VIII's ventures on the continent were more costly and less consistently successful, though they satisfied his desire for martial prestige. Elizabeth preferred limited engagements, supporting allies and rebels indirectly to avoid the full costs of war. Her decision to back the Dutch revolt against Spain and to authorize privateering raids on Spanish shipping allowed England to challenge its rivals without committing to prolonged, large-scale conflict, until the Armada crisis made open confrontation unavoidable. The Tudor period, then, was a time when the nature of monarchy, diplomacy, and governance was shifting. The monarch was still the central figure in the state, but their power was increasingly mediated through institutions like Parliament and through the machinery of a developing bureaucracy. Foreign policy was less about feudal obligations and more about managing a complex web of alliances and rivalries in a Europe moving toward the modern state system. The crown had to balance the assertion of authority at home with the realities of England's position abroad. These challenges demanded a mix of pragmatism, adaptability, and at times ruthlessness. Henry's break with Rome was not a single act but a process, shaped by political calculation as much as personal desire. While the public story was framed around his need to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the deeper transformation lay in the way this decision redefined the relationship between the English crown and the Church. Until that point, the papacy had exercised significant influence over English ecclesiastical life, from the appointment of bishops to the resolution of marriage disputes. By declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, Henry severed that authority and claimed it for the monarchy. This was an ideological shift that challenged centuries of accepted order, but it was also an economic one. The dissolution of monasteries transferred vast wealth and property into the hands of the crown, reducing the power of a religious institution that had long been a parallel authority in the realm. The reallocation of monastic lands reshaped England's social and political map. The beneficiaries were not only the crown but also members of the gentry and nobility who purchased or were granted former church properties. This created a new class of landowners with a vested interest in maintaining the break from Rome, since their fortunes now rested on assets seized from the church. It also disrupted local communities where monasteries had served as centers of charity, education, and healthcare. The sudden removal of these functions left gaps that neither the state nor the Reformed Church was prepared to fill. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising in the north, was in part a reaction to this upheaval. While it was framed in terms of defending the old religion, it was equally about defending the social structures tied to monastic life. Henry's Reformation was neither fully Protestant nor fully Catholic in character. He maintained traditional doctrines like the belief in the real presence in the Eucharist while rejecting papal supremacy. The result was a hybrid religious settlement that satisfied neither extreme. Reformers saw it as incomplete, while conservatives viewed it as heretical. Yet for Henry, this ambiguity was a form of control. By positioning himself as the ultimate arbiter of doctrine, he could define religious truth according to political needs. This approach gave the crown a level of authority over the church unprecedented in England's history. Mary's reign is often reduced to a grim tally of Protestant executions, but this narrow view obscures the broader challenges she faced. She inherited a kingdom that had undergone 2 decades of religious change, where Protestant beliefs had taken root not only among reform-minded clergy, but also in segments of the political elite and merchant class. Her determination to restore Catholicism was not merely a personal devotion, but a belief that England's salvation and stability depended on reunification with Rome. Achieving that goal required navigating a complex web of domestic and international politics. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was intended to strengthen England's position within the Catholic world and provide an heir to secure the succession. Instead, it fueled fears of foreign dominance and tied England to Habsburg conflicts that were unpopular at home. The loss of Calais, England's last continental possession, during a war fought in support of Philip, was a symbolic blow to national pride. Domestically, Mary's restoration of papal authority and revival of heresy laws were met with resistance, culminating in rebellions like Wyatt's Rising. These uprisings were motivated by a mix of religious opposition, nationalist sentiment, and political maneuvering by factions who saw an opportunity to challenge her rule. The burnings of Protestant martyrs, while consistent with the legal framework of heresy prosecution in the era, became a public relations disaster. Accounts of these executions, such as those later recorded in Fox's Book of Martyrs, shaped her posthumous reputation as Bloody Mary. Yet within her own council and court, she was respected for her piety, diligence, and willingness to hear counsel. Her reign revealed the difficulty of reversing a religious settlement once it had been embedded in law and practice. Even with the machinery of the state behind her, Mary could not fully re-Catholicize a realm that had already moved decisively toward Protestant structures in governance and property ownership. Elizabeth's accession brought a deliberate recalibration. Her religious settlement of the first year of her reign was designed to end decades of upheaval by creating a broad, inclusive framework. The Act of Supremacy reasserted royal authority over the Church, this time with the title Supreme Governor, a wording intended to be less provocative to traditionalists. The Act of Uniformity established the use of the Book of Common Prayer, revised to allow a degree of interpretive flexibility on contentious points like the nature of the Eucharist. This settlement did not aim to satisfy the most fervent Catholics or the most ardent Protestants, but to create a workable middle ground that the majority could accept. Maintaining this balance was a constant struggle. Catholic recusants refused to attend Anglican services, and Puritan reformers within the Church sought to strip away remaining elements of Catholic ceremony. The Pope's excommunication of Elizabeth late in her reign intensified the Catholic threat, as it encouraged foreign powers and domestic plotters to see her deposition as a religious duty. Plots such as the Rudolph, Throckmorton, and Babington conspiracies were rooted in this combination of political and religious opposition. Each was met with a mixture of legal prosecution, increased surveillance, and public demonstrations of loyalty to the crown. Elizabeth also understood that religious identity was tied to national identity. The defeat of the Spanish Armada became not only a military victory, but a symbolic affirmation of England's Protestant destiny. The government promoted this narrative through sermons, printed accounts, and public celebrations, reinforcing the idea that divine providence favored the Queen and her church. At the same time, she resisted calls from Puritans for further reform, recognizing that pushing too far in one direction could destabilize the fragile consensus. Her reign demonstrated that religious policy in this period was as much about political management as theological conviction. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England was firmly established as a Protestant nation, but the settlement remained contested at its edges. Catholics continued to worship in secret, and Puritan dissatisfaction laid the groundwork for future conflicts in the 17th century. The religious transformations of the Tudor period were therefore not a straightforward march from Catholicism to Protestantism, but a series of contested settlements, each shaped by the political needs and personal convictions of the monarch. The echoes of these struggles would continue to shape English politics and identity long after the dynasty itself had ended. Life for the majority of people in the Tudor period bore little resemblance to the pageantry of the royal court or the intrigue of high politics. Most lived in rural villages, working the land as tenants or laborers. Their existence was shaped by the agricultural calendar, with tasks dictated by the seasons, plowing and sowing in spring, tending crops in summer, and harvesting in autumn. Winters were a time of relative inactivity in the fields, but also of scarcity, when stored food could run low and illness was more common. Poverty was a constant companion for many, and while some communities supported their poorest members through parish alms or charity from local landowners, others saw beggars as a burden to be controlled through poor laws and punishments. Disease was a frequent and often fatal part of life. Outbreaks of plague, sweating sickness, and other contagious illnesses could devastate entire communities. The spread of disease was worsened by crowded living conditions in towns and poor sanitation. Medical care was basic, with treatments based on humoral theory and herbal remedies. Physicians were few and often expensive, so most relied on local healers or their own knowledge of home cures. Child mortality was high, and the average life expectancy was far lower than in later centuries, though those who survived into adulthood could live into their 50s or 60s. The hierarchical structure of society was visible in every aspect of daily life. Clothing laws regulated what colors and fabrics people of different ranks could wear, reinforcing distinctions between the nobility, gentry, merchants, and laborers. Deference to social superiors was expected, and those who challenged their place in the hierarchy risked social ostracism or legal punishment. Yet within these rigid structures there were opportunities for mobility, especially in towns where trade and skilled crafts could offer paths to greater prosperity. The growth of urban centers created a demand for goods and services that allowed some to rise from modest beginnings to positions of influence within their communities. Commerce was undergoing important changes. The dissolution of the monasteries and the redistribution of their lands brought new landowners into the agricultural market, many of whom embraced more commercial methods of farming. Sheep grazing for the wool trade expanded, feeding a textile industry that was England's most important export sector. Markets and fairs provided opportunities for trade in local goods, while ports like London, Bristol, and Southampton connected England to wider European networks. The merchant adventurers dominated the export of cloth to the Low Countries, while other companies began to explore trade with Russia, the Levant, and beyond. Exploration, though still in its early stages compared to later centuries, was beginning to change England's horizons. Voyages to the New World and the establishment of tentative colonies, such as those attempted in Newfoundland and Virginia, signaled ambitions to compete with Spain and Portugal. Privateers operated under licenses from the Crown, raiding Spanish ships and bringing home valuable cargoes of silver, spices, and other goods. These ventures were risky, but their profits could be immense, and they fed into a growing sense of national pride and maritime identity. Technological innovation also played a part in shaping the era. The printing press, introduced to England in the late 15th century, had by the Tudor period become a powerful tool for the spread of information. Printed books, pamphlets, and broadsheets reached audiences far beyond the universities and monasteries that had once monopolized learning. This facilitated the dissemination of religious ideas during the Reformation, but it also made available practical works on farming, navigation, and household management. Literacy was spreading, particularly among the gentry, merchants, and skilled artisans, though even some laborers could read at a basic level. Grammar schools, often founded or re-endowed with former monastic revenues, provided education for boys who might go on to university or careers in law, the church, or royal service. The spread of literacy had a profound cultural impact. People were increasingly able to engage with religious texts directly, an important factor in the success of Protestantism. The English Bible became a household item in some homes, and sermons were often printed and circulated. Popular literature flourished, with ballads, plays, and chapbooks catering to a wide range of tastes. The theater, particularly in Elizabeth's reign, became a prominent feature of urban life, with playhouses drawing audiences from all social backgrounds. These cultural developments created a more informed, and in some respects, more politically aware populace. In rural communities, traditions and local customs continued to shape life. Seasonal festivals like May Day and harvest celebrations brought relief from the rigors of work, though some of these events came under suspicion from religious reformers who saw them as remnants of pagan or Catholic practice. The church remained a central institution in village life, not only as a place of worship, but as a venue for community gatherings, announcements, and charitable activities. The parish system helped maintain social order, recording births, marriages, and deaths, and administering relief to the poor. Even as religious change swept through the country, these local structures provided continuity and stability. Urban life presented different challenges and opportunities. London was growing rapidly, drawing migrants from across England and beyond. It was a place of wealth and poverty in close proximity. Merchant houses and fine shops stood near crowded alleys where the poor lived in cramped conditions. Guilds regulated trades, set quality standards, and provided mutual support for their members. Apprenticeship offered a structured path into skilled work, though it required years of service under strict conditions. For women, economic roles were more limited, but widows could inherit and run businesses, and many worked in markets, brewing, or as servants. Food and diet varied greatly by social class. The wealthy enjoyed meat, fish, imported spices, and refined sugar, while the poor relied more heavily on bread, pottage, and vegetables, with occasional meat or fish when available. Ale was the common drink for most, as water was often unsafe, and wine was a luxury for those who could afford it. Changes in trade brought new foods to England, such as oranges, raisins, and later potatoes, though these were still rare. Feasting marked special occasions, while fasting days imposed by religious observance shaped weekly eating patterns. Despite the hardships, people found ways to enjoy life and express creativity. Music was a popular pastime across all levels of society, from courtly compositions performed with lutes and viols to simple folk songs sung in taverns. Dancing was enjoyed by both rich and poor, with different styles suited to the ballroom or the village green. Storytelling, whether through oral tradition or in the form of printed tales, provided entertainment and moral instruction. These cultural expressions were not merely diversions, but ways of reinforcing community bonds and shared identity. The Tudor world was thus one of contrasts: wealth and poverty, tradition and change, local life and global horizons. The lives of commoners were shaped by forces far beyond their control: royal policies, international trade, religious reform, but they also adapted to and influenced these changes in their own ways. Commerce, exploration, and education were beginning to connect England more closely to the wider world, while the persistence of local customs and social structures maintained a distinct sense of place. The transformation of daily life in this period laid the groundwork for the social and economic developments that would follow in the centuries to come. The changes set in motion during the Tudor period did not fade with the passing of the dynasty. Many of the decisions taken by the Tudor monarchs became embedded in the political, religious, and cultural fabric of the nation, influencing how Britain would evolve in the centuries that followed. The most enduring of these was the shift in the relationship between the crown and the church. By breaking with Rome, Henry redefined sovereignty, placing ultimate authority within the kingdom itself rather than in the hands of a foreign spiritual leader. This principle would resonate far beyond questions of religion, shaping ideas about national independence and the primacy of domestic law. It also set a precedent for state control over institutions that had once operated outside the direct reach of the monarch. Parliament's growing role during this time, initially a tool for royal policy, gradually became a safeguard against unchecked monarchical power. The habit of enacting major changes through parliamentary statutes created an expectation that laws, even those touching on religion or succession, required legislative endorsement. This did not immediately diminish the authority of the monarch, but it laid the groundwork for the constitutional struggles of the 17th century, when Parliament would claim a more assertive role. The Tudor approach to governance, centralized, bureaucratic, and reliant on written law, was a step toward the modern state, even if it was not conceived as such. The religious settlements of the Tudor monarchs, though contested, fixed Protestantism as a defining feature of English identity. The compromises of Elizabeth's reign, designed to accommodate as many as possible within a single national church, became a model for a certain kind of religious pragmatism. While the settlement left deep divisions, it also allowed for a relatively stable framework that survived the dynasty. The connection between Protestant faith and national security, reinforced by events like the defeat of the Spanish Armada, became a recurring theme in English political culture. In later centuries, these associations would influence foreign policy, domestic law, and the way English history was taught and remembered. The economic changes of the Tudor period also had long-term consequences. The redistribution of monastic lands, the expansion of trade, and the first ventures into overseas exploration helped create a more commercially minded society. Landowners, merchants, and skilled artisans became increasingly influential, forming a social base for future political and economic reforms. London's rise as a commercial hub during this time positioned it to become one of the great cities of Europe in the following centuries. The institutions and networks established under the Tudors, the trading companies, the systems for collecting and managing revenue, the legal frameworks for property, were the infrastructure upon which later imperial expansion would be built. Culturally, the Tudor period was a flowering that shaped the English language and artistic expression for generations. The patronage of the arts by monarchs and nobles encouraged the work of writers, poets, musicians, and painters whose influence extended well beyond their own time. The theater reached new heights, with playwrights like Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Jonson producing works that would define English literature. Their plays not only entertained, but also reflected and commented on political and social realities, engaging audiences in questions about power, loyalty, and human nature. The spread of printing ensured that literature, religious works, and political commentary could reach a broader audience than ever before, fostering a more literate and culturally engaged society. The standardization of the English language was another lasting legacy. As printed books became more common, regional variations in spelling and grammar began to give way to more consistent forms, influenced by the language of the Bible and popular literature. This process, accelerated by the use of English in government and law, helped create a sense of shared national identity. The linguistic foundation laid in the Tudor period would support the later development of English as a global language. The Tudor court itself became a model of cultural display and political theater. Pageants, progresses, and masks were not merely entertainments. They were deliberate expressions of authority and legitimacy. The imagery and symbolism crafted during this time, whether in the form of portraits, coins, or public ceremonies, set patterns for how the monarchy would present itself to the public. Elizabeth's carefully cultivated image as the Virgin Queen, for instance, was as much a political strategy as a personal choice, projecting an ideal of stability, purity, and devotion to the realm. Such conscious image-making remains a feature of political leadership even in modern times. Looking back, it is clear that the Tudor period was a turning point in English history, not simply for the dramatic events and vivid personalities, but for the structural changes that altered the course of the nation. The blend of central authority with legal processes, the intertwining of religious and national identity, the embrace of commerce and exploration, and the cultivation of a distinct cultural voice all contributed to the shape of modern Britain. These developments were not inevitable. They were the product of specific choices made by monarchs, ministers, and ordinary people navigating a rapidly changing world. To view the Tudors only through the lens of personal scandal and court intrigue is to miss the larger story of transformation. Their era challenges us to think about how political decisions ripple outward, affecting the economy, religion, culture, and even the way people understand themselves as part of a nation. It invites us to question the narratives we inherit, to ask whose perspectives are included and whose are left out, and to consider how the forces of change in one period echo into another. The Tudor legacy, reminded that history is not fixed. It is a living conversation between past and present, shaped as much by how we choose to remember as by what actually occurred.